My name is Daniel Abrahams, and what if I told you that China has been quietly positioning themselves to be the number one economic superpower in the world? Hearing that shouldn't surprise you too much. The United States and China have been the fiercest geopolitical beef that we've been hearing about for decades. But with Trump's new tariff administration, this has exacerbated tension, not only with China, but with nations across the world. This has led to the strengthening of foreign alliances, talks of avoiding US dollar domination, as well as solidifying China's role as the most effective manufacturer of electric vehicles, rare earth minerals, and critical battery metals, resources that could decide who leads the next century. While foreign governments know exactly what's happening, the average citizen is left in the dark, leaving ordinary people blind to the opportunities that could redefine wealth and power in the 21st century. Firstly, China is on an absolutely promising path within the electric vehicle market. As of 2024, they accounted for 62% of global EV sales. And since 2018, China's exports of electric vehicles have risen over 1,000%, shipping over 1.6 million units in 2023 alone. China also has the biggest EV market with over 100 competing brands, as well as sphere of production expanding to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. With that level of capacity, Chinese companies are able to offer models at 20 to 30% lower prices than Western rivals such as Tesla. In fact, Tesla and BYD, China's largest EV company, were neck and neck in 2023. Although Tesla remains ahead in full year total EV deliveries, BYD is catching up, even overtaking Tesla's pure BEV sales in 2023 quarter 4. Where Chinese companies such as BYD have an advantage is that they produce their own batteries and chips, as well as targeting China's mass market, where Tesla primarily targets premium consumers. As I said before, Chinese companies are expanding their manufacturing power abroad. Between 2023 to 24, several companies such as BYD and GWM opened EV plants in Thailand and Brazil. BYD's Thailand plant costs around $490 million and produces 150,000 cars a year. Apart from being a fruitful investment for the company, these factories allow China to sell the cars locally, bypassing the burden of hefty tariffs that target Chinese-made exports. Although BYD now commands around 45% of the EV market in Thailand, they also use this tariff bypass to export to other members of ASEAN. This is a huge win-win. BYD avoids UK tariffs by producing right-hand drive EVs in Thailand, and Thailand gains considerable investment and job opportunities. In Africa, Chery and BAIC have invested in assembly lines in South Africa and Egypt. By localizing production, Chinese EV manufacturers both de-risk against trade barriers and curry favor with host governments by promoting job creation. This is setting China up for a big win in these expanding markets. But of course, the US and EU plan to protect their own auto industries from China's cheaper EV imports. The Senate has floated bills to tariff Chinese EVs at 200%, but the current tariffs sit at 100% since the Biden administration. While the EU's 2024 trade probe has established tariff measures accounting for a 10% base tariff that is expendable up to 35% on Chinese EVs. The US and EU are afraid that if Chinese EVs become primarily accepted, especially in emerging markets, China could set the standards for EV production viability. This is in regard to charging, battery technology, and even supply chain norms, creating a world where countries are not only dependent on China for cars, but for the standards that will define the future of transportation. BYD forecasts 800,000 to 1 million deliveries outside of mainland China in 2025. In Europe, Chinese brands held 8% of total EV sales compared to less than 1% in 2019. And that's just the beginning. European trade officials estimate that China has an excess capacity of 1 million units a year, twice the size of the EU's current EV markets. This indicates potential for a huge export wave in the coming years. If Chinese electric vehicles dominate abroad, American brands would most likely struggle to compete overseas, diminishing their global reach. Domestically, the US has so far insulated itself because of these tariff policies. If Chinese companies continue to achieve scale and tech prominence, they could leapfrog Western companies in the next few years. That being said, the US will need to invest heavily in its own supply chains in regard to batteries and materials, and perhaps consider new industrial policies regarding subsidies and friendly alliances with Europe and others to avoid being left behind. In reference to consumers and climate goals, Chinese EV expansion means cheaper electric cars, but at the cost of potential dependency on a strategic rival's technology. But China's dominance in electric vehicles isn't just about production numbers. It begins even deeper with the materials that power them: magnets. Neodymium iron boron magnets, or NIB magnets, are powerful permanent magnets at the heart of EV motors, wind turbines, and several high-tech devices that we use. China has a near monopoly over the supply chain. It produces close to 90% of the world's rare earth magnets and is responsible for refining 92% of rare earth elements as of 2025. In 1992, China's paramount leader Deng Xiaoping did say, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." In July 2023, Beijing quietly added certain elements to its export control list, a measure that could choke off supplies to various competitors. Shipments now require special licenses or government approval, and Beijing can decide when to grant or deny them. Western automakers and turbine makers rely on Chinese magnets almost entirely. If China restricts all exports, it could cripple EV production elsewhere within months. Graphite used in lithium-ion battery anodes is another quiet choke point that China controls. As of 2025, China accounts for 72% of natural graphite mining and over 90% of refining battery-grade graphite globally. And every EV battery needs between 50 to 100 kilograms of coated spherical graphite for its anodes. Until recently, even Tesla was sourcing much of its graphite from China. In 2023, China's Ministry of Commerce also announced that certain high-purity graphite products would require export permits, all under the pretenses of national security. This follows earlier restrictions for germanium, gallium, and NIB alloys. Basically, China can severely disrupt global EV battery production by simply limiting graphite exports, a huge move as the world transitions towards EV adoption. To counteract this move, American, Japanese, and South Korean firms scramble to find non-Chinese graphite sources. This includes sourcing from Mozambique or producing their own synthetic graphite, which is excellent for batteries, but is far more expensive and less available at the scale that China supplies. China has been systematically investing in rare earth mining, most notably in Inner Mongolia, and subsidized magnet manufacturing, driving prices down and competitors out. In 2015, China's oversupply had bankrupted America's last rare earth mine in Mountain Pass, California. This is funny because decades ago, the United States, along with Japan, led the way in rare earths mining and magnet production. In the 1980s, General Motors and Sumitomo had pioneered in neodymium iron boron magnets. It is largely known that the greatest criticism of EV and magnet production is that it creates major toxic waste. Due to increasing environmental regulation, this is a big factor why the United States had dropped out of prominence in these industries. This is also why various nations scold China, which not only tolerated but enhanced pollution in pursuit of global dominance. But in 2018, China, through the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, along with 6 other key ministries, issued policies that require firms to begin developing EV battery and magnet recycling. This marks a big transition to actual environmental responsibility in an industry that's been long criticized for its toxic footprint. Today, Chinese companies such as JL Mag and Shenghe are core players in the magnet industry, and Beijing is pushing hard in recycling to ease the stigma and reduce dependence on dirty mining. But Western firms are looking for alternatives. Tesla specifically has already started experimenting with magnet-free motors using induction motors for some models to reduce dependency. Japan, the EU, and the US are also funding research and development into recycling magnets and exploring alternatives, such as ferrite magnets, a cheaper and more abundant resource, but unfortunately this alternative is much weaker than neodymium iron boron magnets. The West is currently trying to rebuild a supply chain completely from scratch, opening new mines in the US and Australia, as well as early stage magnet factories in the EU. But these efforts will take years and can't possibly catch up to China's hold on the industry. For the US, this is a huge wake up call. We may see initiatives like the Department of Defense stockpiling rare earths, government grants for new graphite processing plants in North America, and new alliances with resource rich countries such as Canada, Australia, and Mozambique to bypass China. If China ever pulled the plug suddenly, it could stall Western EV and renewable industries, a scenario that is comparable to an oil shock in green energy terms. And now China wields the ability to weaponize rare earth exports. We saw this already in 2010, where China cut off Japan over territorial conflict regarding the Senkaku Islands, or in China known as the Diaoyu Islands. When China's Ministry of Commerce announced graphite export controls in 2023, global automakers saw it as retaliation to Western chip sanctions, where Taiwan's TSMC is the dominant supplier for advanced semiconductors. Similarly, in 2024, there were rumors that China could impose trade quotas on rare earth magnet exports if tensions worsened. With Trump's aggressive tariff policies, it's seeming more likely that this could take place. Just the suggestion of a ban alone caused rare earth oxide prices to spike. The US must treat these materials as strategic assets, much like oil. We will likely see the US Department of Defense and Department of Energy funnel money into domestic mining and refining projects, such as Mountain Pass Mining or the Syrup Resources Plant in Louisiana. Building redundancy is key for Western nations. If 90% comes from China, how can the US and its allies bring that down to anything substantially lower? Policies might include tax credits for recycling old electronics for rare earth metals, or subsidizing their own mining and refining projects, like I said before. On the flip side, if China perceives an existential threat from the US, it can embargo these materials to the US overnight. That risk means the US military supply chains for missiles and jets, both of which use rare earth magnets that China produces, could be exposed and neutralized. But China doesn't just control the world's rare earth supply, they also have a hold on cobalt, Africa's blue gold. Cobalt is a key ingredient for lithium-ion batteries, which are used to stabilize cathodes. The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, absolutely dominates reserves and production, holding around 55% of the world's cobalt reserves, 75% of annual output, and was the origin of 68% of refined cobalt in China between 2023 to 2024. Over the past decade, Chinese mining companies, often backed by state loans, have brought up many of these mines in Africa. By 2023, Chinese firms owned or had stakes in 15 of the DRC's 19 largest cobalt mines, giving them control over an estimated 70% of DRC's cobalt production. For example, China Molybdenum, or CMOC, owns the huge Tenke Fugurume mine. This means China has a chokehold on upstream cobalt at the source. Owning mines is only half the story. China has invested massively in processing raw ores into battery-grade materials. It is estimated that 73% of the world's cobalt is refined in China. Similar patterns exist in other important minerals. China refines 68% of nickel, 59% of lithium, and about 40% of copper globally. But you should already know the story by now. These figures far exceed China's share of the raw ore, highlighting how other countries ship their ores to China for value-added processing. Even non-DRC cobalt from places like Australia and the Philippines often end up in Chinese refineries. This means even if Western companies secure a mine in Africa, they still have to send it to China for processing into battery chemicals. You may ask, how is China approaching their influence in Africa? Well, China is making way through their resource for infrastructure approach. We can see this through the Mines agreement in DRC. Signed in 2007, Mines was a $6.2 billion minerals for infrastructure deal, $3.2 billion for mine development, and another $3 billion for critical infrastructure in exchange for exclusive mining rights for 10 million tons of copper and 600,000 tons of cobalt in reserves. Although the deal promised $3 billion in infrastructure financed by China were paid through mining profits, the DRC's government noticed that only $822 million of infrastructure had been delivered in 2023. This obviously created a point of contention between the two countries. After a state audit found huge disparities in financing, President Tshisekedi pushed for renegotiation to boost infrastructure investment by $4 billion to better reflect the mine's value. While negotiations are still ongoing, this conflict alone shows how these host countries can leverage transparency through the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative to push China for fairer deals. If the DR succeeds in more roads, schools, and other valuable infrastructure, it could set a precedent for other African nations to revisit mining deals. This can both slow down China's progress and provide opportunities for Western nations. Still, China is expanding its refining reach well beyond its borders. In Indonesia, Chinese giants like Tsingshan have poured billions into nickel smelters. This is following Indonesia banning raw ore exports in 2020 to ensure domestic revenue for the country. In Latin America, companies like CATL and Ganfeng Lithium are securing lithium projects in Bolivia and Argentina. And in Africa, China is building their own processing facilities. For instance, Zambia hosts massive cobalt and copper processing plants backed by CNMC, CMOC, and others in the Katanga region. This is important because it could gradually localize some value add in several regions, while still keeping ultimate control through ownership and technology transfer. And as I said before, the US government has reacted by supporting alternate cobalt sources, such as signing an MOU with the DRC and Zambia in 2022 to develop an EV battery supply chain of their own that bypasses China. The US International Development Finance Corps is also investing in projects like a new nickel cobalt refinery in Indonesia and exploring partnerships in Morocco for cobalt. But with China controlling both the mines and the refineries, can the West really break free from Beijing's tight grip on cobalt and other critical elements? Up to now, we've looked at Chinese EV exports and a few multi-purpose factories abroad, but those moves are just part of something bigger. Beijing's strategy to replicate entire manufacturing ecosystems. China isn't just exporting cars and rare earths, they're exporting factories. Take BYD, the Chinese EV poster child. By mid-2025, it was selling cars in more than 50 countries and was either building or planning overseas plants across Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Automobility estimates China's EV excess capacity reaches somewhere between 5 and 10 million vehicles a year, even with 30 million units being sold domestically in 2023. The result? A ferocious price war in China's EV market. Dozens of brands slashed prices to move inventory. Some new EVs were being sold at 50% markdowns or even dumped as used with delivery miles. But all that surplus had to go somewhere. Chinese auto exports of all types hit 5+ million units in 2023, making it the world's #1 auto exporter, ahead of Japan, driven largely by EVs. Despite extensive support from the government and large domestic market, most Chinese companies aren't even profitable. This has pushed firms to seek markets abroad aggressively, essentially exporting the surplus. As of 2024, Chinese automakers and battery makers invest more in overseas plants than domestic plants. Chinese foreign direct investment rebounded to about $58 billion in 2024 after years of decline. According to Rhodium and Merrick's data, overall Chinese FDI rose about 10% in 2024 alone, with greenfield projects at a record high. For example, 83% of Chinese greenfield investment in 2024 in Europe was EV or battery related. We can see this with CATL's battery gigafactory in Germany that cost over $2 billion and numerous other projects throughout Europe. Emerging economies in Asia also saw big inflows in investment. Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand each got billions of dollars for new Chinese manufacturing projects between 2023 and 2024. According to Rhodium Group, Chinese EV companies' domestic investment plunged from $41 billion to $15 billion in 2023, while foreign investment surged and overtook domestic. As I said before, this is primarily driven by aims of building in target markets to avoid tariffs. To circumvent high import tariffs, especially amidst trade tensions, Chinese automakers are using completely knockdown assembly strategies abroad. Completely knockdown or CKD.
For instance, in Mexico, where a 25% tariff on Chinese-made cars now apply, JAC Motors set up a CKD assembly line in Hidalgo to import Chinese car kits and assemble them locally. This clever move avoids the tariffs and qualifies the cars as being Mexican-made. Similarly, SAIC MG, which is a fast-growing brand in Mexico, is actively scouting for local production to bypass tariffs. And Geely's Volvo has also signaled that it may shift production closer to North America to benefit from the EU-Mexico trade agreements. But GWM and Chery have used CKD assembly in markets like Egypt and Russia for years. Chinese EV makers are willing to build small assembly operations in target countries to label their cars as made in not China. These satellite plans can be as simple as bolting kits together, but they still sidestep both tariffs and political scrutiny. The word de-risking usually refers to Western economies reducing their reliance on China. Now Chinese companies are de-risking their dependence on the Chinese market and label. By having large factories in Europe, such as BYD in Hungary, Asia with BYD and GWM in Thailand, and Latin America with GWM in Brazil and maybe soon in Africa, they can mitigate the impact of any single country's trade policy. This global footprint also helps Chinese firms learn local regulations and improve their own international image, being seen as job creators rather than just importers. For example, Great Wall or GWM's plant in Brazil will assemble hybrids and very possibly pure EVs for the Latin American markets. BYD's Brazil plant is making electric buses and cars, tapping into Brazil's huge auto market with less political pushback. Now, let's think about this from a geopolitical side. If tensions continue to rise, Chinese companies want to stake in as many countries as possible so that local stakeholders, such as workers and politicians, have a vested interest in keeping them around, blunting outright bans. This doesn't mean China isn't cautious in their aims. There are reports that Beijing worries about technology leakage and loss of domestic manufacturing jobs due to this wave of foreign investment. Suggestions of tighter controls on EV-related technology taken abroad have been floated. Nonetheless, in forums like the Canton Fair of 2024 specifically, Chinese officials encourage firms to go out and build brands globally. The US now might even see Chinese companies building more battery component plants in Southeast Asia or even North America, such as Gotian, Seebach, and others planning to set up new facilities in the US. On one hand, if Chinese companies build more outside of China, it could reduce US-China trade friction, since fewer products come directly from China. But on the other hand, it means China's industrial reach becomes more global, making it harder for the US to contain. US tariffs and bans could be less effective if Chinese goods are routed through or made in intermediary countries. For US businesses, China's overcapacity moving outward certainly means fiercer competition in neutral markets. This may push the US toward more complex rules of origin regulations and alliance building to monitor Chinese investments. This means that the US could pressure its allies not to host certain Chinese tech factories. But as we see, many countries are already starting to benefit from Chinese move to global manufacturing. So who knows how this will go? This diffusion of China's manufacturing will make trade decoupling harder. If a Chinese car is built in Thailand with parts from all over, is it still Chinese? These kind of questions will complicate US and EU trade policy going forward. Apart from manufacturing expansion, China is also currently expanding their sphere of influence in regard to trade. They are doing so with great collaboration with RCEP and BRICS. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, launched in January 2022. It links China with 14 other Asia-Pacific countries, including all 10 ASEAN members, plus Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. This trade zone encompasses about 30% of global GDP and 2.3 billion people. RCEP is progressively reducing tariffs amongst all members, with an estimated 90% of tariffs to be eliminated within 20 years. Intra-RCEP trade hit $1.67 billion for China in 2024, going up 4.4% year over year, even as its trade with the US declined. China is clearly reorienting supply chains towards China. RCEP is also very rules light compared to Trans-Pacific partnerships, as it doesn't mandate labor or environmental standards, which we know clearly suits China. BRICS is another story. It originally began as an economic forum between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all frustrated with Western domination. 6 additional countries were invited to join BRICS in 2024. This would be Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iran, Argentina, and Ethiopia. If all join, BRICS Plus would represent 45 to 50% of the world population and around 40% of global GDP. China is the heavyweight driving this, seeing BRICS as a platform to build an alternative order. BRICS Plus would have big oil producers like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and the UAE, huge markets like India and Brazil, and mineral-rich countries like South Africa and Russia. One major aim of BRICS is to conduct more trade in local currencies and reduce reliance on the US dollar. They have even flirted with the idea of a BRICS common currency for trade settlements. China and Russia already trade oil in yuan and rubles. And in 2023, China and Brazil agreed to settle trade in yuan and reais. The new development bank, or the BRICS Bank, is also expanding membership and could fund more projects in several local currencies. Since 2015, the BRICS New Development Bank has lent over $39 billion and has started issuing bonds in yuan to reduce dollar use. This includes an RMB bond in China worth 8.5 billion won in 2023. All of this challenges US and EU financial influence. By late 2024, the yuan share of global trade finance had jumped about to 5%, up from only 2% before. In fact, in 2023, the yuan even overtook the euro in trade finance usage, now second only to the US dollar. This has a lot to do with global sanctions on Russia, as well as Gulf oil exporters such as ADNOC, Saudi Aramco, and soon possibly Qatar Energy accepting yuan in trade. It's worth noting that in 2023, about 26% of China's trade was settled in yuan, reducing China's vulnerability to dollar volatility. While the US dollar still dominates global trade, with 80% of trade finance and 60% of foreign exchange reserves, this incremental shift is happening in the sphere of China's new trade map. China is also transitioning to digital yuan cross-border payments as well. Their goal? Make yuan a top international currency so BRICS members can trade without worrying about US dollar access or Western banks. For instance, RCEP means Asian countries trading with each other more at lower tariffs, potentially substituting trades that used to go through Western markets. ASEAN as a group has already become China's #1 trade partner since 2020, overtaking the EU. Similarly, BRICS nations are discussing an alternative to SWIFT for payments, especially after Russia was bombarded with sanctions. BRICS could potentially expand the use of China's interbank payment system or other developing interbank systems. In addition, BRICS and others are exploring barter or commodity-backed trading, such as when India was buying African commodities through credit rather than hard currency. This severely contrasts Western nations, especially the US's reliance on fiat currency as a medium for trade, which is gradually losing its value. As of October 2025, the US dollar had already lost 10% of its value compared to other currencies. While these are still early-stage ideas, the East is clearly heading towards an alternative trade system where the West's rules and financial leverage hold less sway. And China is positioning itself at the center of that web, as the main consumer of commodities, manufactured goods, and a lead financier through its banks. If RCEP deepens Asia's interdependence without the US, American exporters could definitely lose market share and influence in the fastest growing region. In regard to BRICS, its expansion and motives signal a clear pathway for more countries to align in Global South frameworks that exclude the G7. So, what should the US do? Well, they will definitely need to double down on their relationship with allies. This includes pushing new trade agreements like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Unfortunately, this doesn't yield the same benefits of reducing tariffs that RCEP aims to provide. They will also need to increase its economic presence in Africa and Latin America to counteract China's. We may see the American strategy shift to outcompeting China within these regions, offering alternative investments such as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment and other initiatives similar to the EU's Global Gateway. But the fact of the matter is this: the US must acknowledge that these new trade systems will emerge and must take effective measures to compete accordingly and maintain influence. As I mentioned before, Africa is a treasure trove of raw materials that power EVs, renewable energy, and other future industries. The continent holds between 70 to 75% of the world's cobalt, 30% of manganese, and at least 40% of palladium and platinum. And with newly proven lithium deposits in Zimbabwe, Africa could hold up to 5% of the world's lithium reserves. Rare earth elements are also emerging as a new frontier within Burundi, Tanzania, and Malawi. In short, Africa is geologically blessed for the green transition, and whoever secures Africa's resources secures a piece of the EV and battery future. As I noted before, China has already deeply entrenched itself in the DRC's mining sector. Chinese firms like CMOC, China Railway Group, and the China Non-Ferrous Metal Mining Group now control or co-own some of the world's most productive cobalt and copper mines. In contrast, in South Africa, Chinese investment in mining has been more limited despite its vast mineral wealth. Why? Partly because South Africa has a more established Western and local mining giants such as Anglo American, Glencore, and others with a stronger regulatory environment. Powerful labor unions, stringent environmental standards, and black economic empowerment rules make it harder for Chinese firms to operate freely. But it's very possible with the BRICS alliance strengthening even further, we could see a growth in collaboration in several industries, including mining, between these two countries. So, China's African mining strategy looks quite asymmetric. Aggressive and higher risk, high reward countries like the DRC and Zambia, but more careful and formalized institutional economies such as South Africa and Botswana. China's investment pattern also reflects governance difference, where its biggest mining ventures are often in countries where corruption and regulatory opacity make for easier entry and competition thinner. China's mineral interests in Africa have always been tied to infrastructure. The Tanzania-Zambia Railway, built in the 1970s by China, was the first major example. It is a lifeline that helped Zambia export copper through Tanzanian ports instead of apartheid-era South Africa. This was the first step in building a foundation for China's influence in Africa. Since then, Beijing has financed everything from Kenya's Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway to highways linking Kolwezi's Cobalt Belt to export to ports. These aren't just logistical upgrades, they are lifelines that feed Chinese supply chains. More recently, Beijing's focus has shifted towards industrial clusters that support resource processing. For example, the Tira-Suez Economic Zone in Egypt now hosts more than 130 Chinese companies and over $3 billion in Chinese investment, while Chinese developers in Zambia and Zimbabwe are integrating smelters, refineries, and small manufacturing zones around major mines. Across the continent, these projects connect under the umbrella of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which now spans 52 African nations and are increasingly targeting energy, ports, and transports, all directly tied to resource supply chains. What's less visible, but just as strategic, is how China is building Africa's digital infrastructure. Huawei has constructed roughly 70% of sub-Saharan Africa's 4G networks, working with more than 40 national carriers, and is now launching 5G trials in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. To add on top of this, Huawei and ZTE have launched data centers in Johannesburg and Nairobi, while Alibaba Cloud and Huawei Cloud are quietly competing to dominate Africa's cloud computing market. Jeff Bezos, Sam Altman, Jensen Huang, and Mark Zuckerberg have all emphasized the growing need for large data centers, especially in this AI-driven digital age. While these efforts are often branded as digital inclusion, they also establish deep technological dependency on China, African governments are relying on Chinese companies for cybersecurity, cloud services, and telecom maintenance. These efforts all build towards China's digital Silk Road agenda, integrating fiber optic networks, surveillance systems, and e-government solutions into national modernization programs for historically underdeveloped African nations. The payoff? China is both the builder and the gatekeeper of these digital systems that will power Africa's future economies. I've also touched upon how China is quietly testing the internationalization of the yuan across Africa. Through currency swap agreements, the People's Bank of China have allowed central banks to settle trade in yuan rather than US dollars. South Africa, for example, has swapped 30 billion won, Egypt 18 billion won, and Nigeria 15 billion won, which was actually renewed in 2024. This is especially beneficial since China remains Africa's largest trading partner. And all of these agreements encourage investment, stabilize trade, and a growing acceptance of yuan in comparison to the dollar. Meanwhile, the China African Development Fund and the Export-Import Bank of China have extended billions in concessional loans for infrastructure and energy. Increasingly priced in yuan, these efforts align with Beijing's push towards an RMB clearing network, building banking hubs starting with Johannesburg and Cairo that let trade to be settled directly in Chinese currency without going through the US dollar system. China is playing chess. By normalizing trade with Africa in yuan and reducing dollar dependence, they are not just becoming the continent's builder, but their banker as well. On another note, in 2017, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, giving the People's Liberation Army Navy a permanent logistics and replenishment hub at one of the world's most strategic choke points, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This base links the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean together. Though it's officially described as a peacekeeping support base, it allows China to protect shipping routes and its assets along the Horn of Africa. Chinese state-owned enterprises operate the Doralay multi-purpose port in the Free Trade Zone, illustrating how China's economic and military activities in Djibouti overlap, forming a dual-use network. Since then, Chinese construction firms have helped finance or upgrade ports in Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. This is forming what several have acknowledged as a string of trade ports along Africa's east coast. This network ensures that Chinese companies can move minerals and manufactured goods to market, while also giving Beijing a geopolitical leverage over critical shipping routes. Apart from trade and infrastructure, China has also significant cultural influence in Africa. Beijing has used education, media, and culture as tools of diplomacy. For example, CGTN in Africa initially launched in Nairobi in 2012, which broadcast Chinese-produced content across the continent, promoting narratives of mutual development and countering Western media framing. Meanwhile, Confucius Institutes teach Mandarin and host cultural programs that promote long-term familiarity with Chinese society and governance. There are now 60 Confucius Institutes across 47 nations, combined with China's industrial investment and infrastructure financing. This approach has led many to argue that China is positioning themselves for a form of neocolonial influence over Africa. China also remains a top destination for African students. As of 2018, over 80,000 African students were studying in China, many through government-sponsored scholarships. This has created a new generation of elites, engineers, diplomats, and entrepreneurs educated under Chinese systems and fluent in Mandarin. Through scholarships, training programs, and state media, China is shaping Africa's next professional class in its own image. As Africa modernizes, political shifts will determine the pace and nature of Chinese engagement. In Zambia, President Hakainde Hichilema's reforms and debt restructuring have reopened the country to Western investors while maintaining cooperation with China. Notably, Zimbabwe has leaned heavily towards Chinese partnerships, especially within lithium, even as allegations of corruption and labor abuses still continue to arise. If a governance reformation continues to happen across Africa, it could weaken China's dominance by giving Western, Japanese, and Indian companies the confidence to re-enter African markets. But China's head start still remains massive. It already has built the roads, wired the networks, and educated the people. They weren't just investing in Africa, but integrating it in its global sphere of influence. Africa is the next frontier for US-China competition.
For Washington, D.C., this is not about charity, but strategic survival. Programs like the Mineral Security Partnership and the PGII aim to counter China's dominance by funding alternative mining and infrastructure projects, usually in collaboration with Japan, the EU, and Australia.
But the US still faces challenges: slower levels of bureaucracy, stricter oversight of environmental regulations and corruption, and an extensive history of underinvestment in Africa's industrial complex. If America hopes to compete, it must engage Africa not just as a supplier of resources, but as a partner for development, helping to industrialize, digitalize, and further empower African economies. Otherwise, China's fast, flexible, and already immersed strategy will continue to win. I know we've talked a lot about what China's doing, but it's also important to note the measures that the West is taking, and they're not taking them lightly. Apart from tariffs on EVs and solar panels and all that other stuff, the United States leads with export controls on high tech. In October 2022, Washington, D.C. banned exports of cutting edge semiconductor chips and equipment to China, notably blocking NVIDIA's A100 and H100 AI chips, as well as ASML's EUV lithography from reaching Chinese firms. This created a serious point of contention between the two countries. Hundreds of Chinese entities that specialize in AI, telecom, and defense are on the US entity list, meaning US companies can't supply them tech without a license. Additionally, Western nations have ramped up investment screening. The US is considering outbound investment controls to prevent capital and know-how from flowing to Chinese sensitive sectors. And the EU has implemented an FDI screening mechanism to collectively vet Chinese acquisitions in Europe. The EU screened over 400 foreign investments under its new mechanism, with many Chinese deals getting a second look. In 2023, the G7 collectively agreed on a strategy to de-risk from China, reducing dependence on Chinese inputs like critical minerals and 5G infrastructure. We've seen this through the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act and the US friendshoring of battery supply with Canada, Australia, and others. These moves aim to create a fault line in supply chains, rooting around China wherever possible. But as you know, China doesn't take things lightly either. I've already mentioned earlier how after US chip controls, China announced export curbs on gallium and germanium, which are extremely important for semiconductors and military tech. Gallium is essential for RF and LED chips, and germanium for fiber optics and infrared. China supplies over 90% of gallium and 60% of germanium globally. As their gallium exports immediately dropped almost completely, this caused huge panic for foreign chip material suppliers. Surprisingly, the United States does not have a strategic stockpile for gallium. Recently, Beijing had started actively enforcing their anti-sanctions law, which could penalize firms that comply with Western sanctions. China in recent years has put much more pressure on American firms within China, such as the police investigation on Bain, Capvision, Mint Group, and others. And of course, China is building its own capabilities by pouring money into chip research and development to break free from the US-Dutch chokeholds and stockpiling advanced technologies and materials to withstand export controls. It's very possible that we might see China use its influence on countries like Brazil and Saudi Arabia to not align with G7 restrictions on China. It's also worth noting that Chinese firms have found many opportunities with open source AI models rather than proprietary models. I plan to talk about that in my next video, but keep that in mind. And to expand further on Africa, as much as it's an opportunity, it's also a huge point of contention. Several African nations are becoming wary of overdependence on China or are under severe pressure to ensure that mining deals are actually in favor of the country. The virtue of resource nationalism is very real for these countries. Many could start to impose export taxes or even seize foreign-owned assets like China's. In 2022, Zimbabwe banned exports of raw lithium to force miners to set up local processing. And in the DRC, there's talk of a greater state share in mining ventures, ever since the new DRC mining code has raised royalties and government stakes in 2018, which Chinese firms had to swallow. Also, African politics can flip. A coup or election can suddenly put a very grassroots oriented regime into power. As we see in the news all the time, Africa has a reputation for political instability. Recently, coups in Mali and Guinea have led to uncertainty around Chinese mining and infrastructure contracts. If Chinese companies are seen as allied with corrupt old regimes, they could face backlash under new leadership. Fortunately for the West, this is a chance to express a display of fair deals and transparency. But if African governance doesn't improve, Western firms will remain hesitant to enter, leaving the continent largely to China. The PGII is aiming to mobilize around $600 billion for global infrastructure by 2027, specifically targeting areas like Africa, Latin America, and Asia for investment in digital, energy, and transport projects. In 2022, the US and others announced a plan to support Angola's rare earth mining as a non-China source. The EU's Global Gateway promises €300 billion for similar aims. We have already seen 10 African nations engage with the Mineral Security Partnership or sign critical mineral MOUs with the US and or EU. And on the tech side, the Chip4 alliance including the US, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea is intact to secure semiconductor supply without China. This is where China feels it most. And recently, at the 2023 G20, the ambitious India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor was unveiled. This could be a potential connective infrastructure rival to China's modern Silk Road, linking India ports to Europe through Gulf states by rail and sea. If or when fully realized, it provides an alternative trade route that doesn't go through China's sphere of influence. All of these efforts are aimed at hardening the fault lines, ensuring critical supply chains, infrastructure finance, and standards are set by the US and its allies, rather than leaving countries no choice but China. We should note that pushback can be a slippery slope. If each side keeps restricting more exports, the US on tech, China on materials, global industries might split entirely. As I was writing this section, that day Trump announced a 100% additional tariff on China, which completely disrupted the crypto markets, the financial markets. Yeah, it was tough. Companies are already rethinking supply chains. Apple is shifting some production to India and Vietnam, while Chinese tech firms are already designing products without US chips. As I said before, looking into open source modeling, which they've been doing a pretty good job so far. Africa and others could become proxy competitions, our version of the arms race. And countries are already feeling the pressure to choose sides, with the Netherlands aligning with the US on chip exports and the UAE leaning into BRICS. These fault lines, if becoming poorly managed, could stunt global growth. Imagine EVs becoming more expensive due to fragmented supply, or AI development slowed by a split in the chip industry. This could also further stoke conflict between the nations. A large area of worry is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which could trigger full Western sanctions and decouple global economies overnight. Domestically, US policies like the CHIPS Act aim to ensure that even if things split, the US has onshore capabilities through subsidies for domestic fabs. So, what should the US do? Well, they need to tread a fine line. On one hand, the US wants to protect its technological advantage in supply chains, but on the other, if the US pushes too aggressively, it could alienate partners or accelerate the bifurcation it fears. Managing the coalition is crucial. Keeping Europe and others on board with the tough stance against China requires unity. This is where the US needs to tread carefully. If the US starts sanctioning allies for doing business with China, that could backfire. This is funny because I remember hearing reports of Trump ordering several leaders, including Prime Minister Modi, to restrict their trade with China, in which there were several reports of Modi ignoring Trump's calls several times. Note that these are just simply reports and even possibly rumor, and so they might not be real at all, but I could definitely see that Trump's attitude currently can be seen as off-putting for other leaders to collaborate, to say the least. Diplomatically,
America should probably pick its battles, focusing on restricting military technology, but not basic goods, as to not completely sever global economic ties. But it's safe to say that Trump's volatile tariff policy is definitely not helping the US in that regard. Essentially, the US and its allies are trying to build a techno-economic wall around China in its most sensitive areas, while China is poking holes through that wall. How effectively the US fortifies those fault lines without completely dismantling trade alliances, global industries, and financial stability will shape the next decade of global economics. And let's not forget, China knows a thing or two about walls. Despite China's strides in various industries, it does remain behind in cutting-edge semiconductors. In 2025, China's AI development still relies heavily on American chip imports. The most advanced chips come from TSMC and Samsung, which both are reliant on US, Dutch, and Japanese lithography tools. But the US and Japan have cut exports of the highest performing chips, where SMIC's 7nm process is still limited, achieved only through DUV tools. ASML still holds a 100% monopoly on EUV machines and cannot sell them to China. This is an extreme point of contention that means that China's bets on AI, supercomputing, and advanced military technology all hit a wall if it can't get or make top chips. China is stockpiling them where they can. Where there were reports that say Chinese firms that rushed in to buy NVIDIA A100 GPUs right before bans. The chokehold on chips is an evident breaking point. If the US and allies stay unified, China might struggle to achieve self-sufficiency at the leading edge for coming years. But if China finds a way around this, like through illegal smuggling, if China offers a fruitful proposition to a neutral country, or they continue to make strides in open source modeling, that could upend US strategy. But for now, semiconductors are a clear vulnerability for China's tech ambitions. And the Taiwan situation is the United States' greatest deterrent against China in this chip conflict. If China were to attempt reunification by force, it would likely destroy or disable TSMC's facilities, as the West would try to evacuate engineers and even sabotage fabs to prevent China from capturing them. Think of the Hannibal Directive for crucial AI technology. This means that in a conflict, China could ironically lose the very supply of chips it needs, crippling its economy and military production. Taiwan is simultaneously China's goal and a potential breaking point of its tech supply. This situation highlights how precarious some of China's dependencies are, and how this ambitious political move could backfire economically. Moving on, China is the world's largest energy importer. China imported 11.3 million barrels of oil per day in 2023. It imports 75% of its crude oil and about 41% of its natural gas, either as LNG or from pipelines. Its rapid growth made it hugely dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas from Russia and Central Asia. This is China's response to the Malacca dilemma, where most Arab oil must transit through the Malacca Strait and Indian Ocean, in which the US Navy or allies could interdict it in a conflict. China has also tried to mitigate this by building several pipelines throughout Russia, Myanmar, Yunnan, and others. China has also been diversifying their suppliers, where they now buy oil from over 10 countries. They've also been stockpiling a strategic petroleum reserve, but it's been estimated that they only have 90 days or so of import cover. If a geopolitical crisis led to an embargo or blockade, China could face fuel shortages that paralyze its economy and military. In developed markets, public opinion towards China has grown sour, with record high unfavorable views in both the EU and the United States. This drives governments to block Chinese acquisitions, like the several we've mentioned across industries. And in developing countries, populist backlash has toppled or pressured pro-China regimes. Malaysia's 2018 election scrutinized a China-friendly government amid anger over BRI deals. Even Sri Lanka's debt crisis made Chinese loans a taboo phrase in local politics. Even where governments remain pro-China, popular sentiment can get ugly, as seen with violent protests in Zambia's mining towns over 10 years ago, or in Kenya, where locals protested Chinese-run railway management.
The more China is seen as a neo-colonial power, extracting resources, importing Chinese labor, and leaving debt, the more pushback it will face. And several Chinese projects, especially mining and infrastructure in Africa and Latin America, face criticism for environmental damage and social displacement. A 2021 study found that Chinese overseas projects had many more environmental complaints than do OECD partners. For instance, Chinese run mines in Zambia and DRC have had accidents and pollution issues that anger local communities. In Ghana, illegal small scale gold mining by some Chinese individuals had become a national scandal known as Galamsey. Environmental protests have occurred in Kenya against the Chinese backed coal plant Lamu. And in Myanmar, the massive Myitsone Dam was halted in 2011 after public outcry over environmental impacts. Chinese companies have also been criticized heavily for often importing their own labor, limiting local job creation, and sparking cultural clashes. These factors can undermine China's global ambitions, making international projects untenable, which is counterintuitive to their objectives of internationalizing their manufacturing reach. In addition, Western rival blocs are trying to cherry pick the areas where they can outcompete China. Japan with supplying quality infrastructure in Asia, Europe with pushing green energy partnerships in Africa, and the US leveraging its tech capabilities. These competing offers give third world countries leverage to not be overly dependent on China, limiting their market access. And with the resurgence and birth of new partnerships, they are directly trying to compete with China and its allies' growing sphere of influence. If these Western and partner led initiatives gain traction, some countries could pivot away from China's warm embrace. For instance, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are historically close to China economically, are also courting the US and Europe for investments, like when the UAE purchased French fighter jets or Saudi Arabia partnering with Foxconn on EV production. Now, the US strategy is in many ways to pressure test these potential breakpoints for China. Keep the chip chokehold on so China's AI and military can't easily surpass the US. Keep a clear naval presence in the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Malacca Strait, as well as other crucial oil lifelines if China overreaches. And support civil society and good governance abroad so that China's corruption and environmental faults can be exposed and resisted. However, the US must also mind its own dependencies on China, such as electronics and critical minerals. Reducing those dependencies through reshoring or friendshoring will bolster the US position in any economic conflict. There's also a global information component. The US can further highlight examples of China's faults to caution others. The US could highlight how some BRI projects have led to debt traps, or how Chinese technology often comes with surveillance strings attached. Just as Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Zambia what they think. But the US must avoid underestimating China's resilience. They are still pouring billions into chip research and development. It might not catch up to TSMC soon, but it can make strides in older generation chips and new approaches. And on energy, China is investing heavily in renewables and EVs to reduce oil dependency, which is partly why they are pushing EVs so hard. So these breaks in China's plans are not guaranteed failures. They are battlefronts where the US will have to concentrate their efforts to ensure that those vulnerabilities remain vulnerabilities. So, we finally reached the end of the video. I know it was quite a lot to go over, but hopefully you came out a little bit more educated on what's going on in the world. From global EV production to new developments and trade alliances, China is truly positioning themselves for big changes to come, especially amid this era of political and economic volatility. We've talked about where China is making huge strides and where the West is pushing back against them. Truth be told, no matter which way things go, there will be countless opportunities sitting for the taking, but they're not going to wait for you. Professionals of various industries are already preparing themselves to take advantage of the opportunities that will redefine the dynamics of wealth in the 21st century. International trade, logistics, AI, global finance, manufacturing, policy, and much more will drastically change as we know it. From the time I spent researching, writing, and recording this video,
Not only have I become more aware of how important this tension is between the United States and China, but my perspectives have completely shifted, and I am much more interested in exploring the implications of what this means for us, the average citizen, and how we can benefit from what's to come. I've done my job so far. I did my research, shared all of the information that I've gathered, and left my sources in the description below. I've already started developing my own strategy in preparation for the crazy changes that we'll be seeing in the coming years or even months. Now it's your job to do your own research and learn how to capitalize on the opportunities that will change industries, push countries in and out of prominence, and produce new generations of wealth. Some people refuse to believe that the United States is able to be overtaken in global dominance. It's just something that we're so used to hearing. But as Junior Soprano once said,
some people are so far behind in a race that they actually believe they're leading.
Yeah, that's cute.
millions of people are waiting for their chance to leverage the right opportunity to build a formidable future for themselves in this wild time of change. Are you?